The Father is called Yahweh God, the Spirit is called Yahweh God, and Jesus is called Yahweh God. There's only one Yahweh. How do we figure this out? So what they do is eventually they come up with this language of being and person. Being describes what you are, person describes who you are. This chair has being. It's what philosophers called ontological status, but it doesn't have personhood. I didn't ask its permission to sit on it.
Right.
But it does exist.
Yeah.
And so being is what you are. God is Yahweh. And we see this, Jesus tells his disciples to go baptize in the name, and then he says, of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So he says the singular name, but then he describes three persons. And so this is the question the early church is wrestling through, and they say, okay, Jesus is given the honors, the attributes, the names, the deeds, and the seat of God. It's an acronym, HANDS. The Spirit is given the honors, the attributes, the names, the deeds, and the seat of God. And the Father is given the honors, the attributes, the names, the deeds, and the seat of God. There's only one God. How do we understand this? Now, the ancient Jews actually already had a concept of this in that they weren't Unitarian fully. God can rule and reign in heaven, and yet the Ark of the Covenant could still have God's presence. Before Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham is met by three individuals, two that are identified as angels and one that is identified as Yahweh God. The angels go off to Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham dialogues with Yahweh. Eventually, Abraham leaves, and then in chapter 19, in Genesis 19, says that Yahweh on earth rains fire and brimstone from Yahweh in heaven. Now, you only have one Yahweh, so what's going on there? Well, we would say, within like a Christian framework, this is the pre-incarnate Christ. He is not enfleshed in who Jesus is, but this is the complex unity. And the Jews understand this, and even early on in rabbinical Judaism, there's also this idea of the Shevrot, which are like the presence and spirit of God all throughout the earth. So in that sense, ancient Judaism, sometimes it's called the two powers in heaven. I don't love that kind of articulation, but in academia, that's what it's called. That God is ruling and reigning in heaven and still has a presence on earth. Only one God, but there's something else going on there that maybe we don't fully understand. But then God lives in a set of living, loving relationships. He has existed eternally in relationship and in love.
Yeah.
Right? That's what John says in 1 John. God is love. God does not need to create in order to experience anything. Creation is an outpouring of his love. Now, this is different than, say, a Unitarian monotheistic faith like Islam. In Islam, in one sense, philosophically, God does need to create to experience love, because love requires an object and a subject. And so, in order to feel love, the Unitarian God of something like Islam needs the object in order to feel that. That's not true for Christianity. The Father has been loving the Son in the power of the Holy Spirit forever. The early Christians are wrestling through these things in order to formulate the language of this. Eventually, they come up with this idea, one being in three persons. Being describes what you are, persons describe who you are.
So today we're actually going to be talking about Islam. Now, what I do want to do is I want to go through that video again, and my guys in the back are going to start and stop it at certain points, because that was really fast, and I do want to play it over again just so we can go through it. And it's really important that we understand not only Trinitarian doctrine, as we've already gone through, we hit that pretty heavily with Jehovah's Witnesses last week, a little bit when we did Mormonism, and a little bit when we did the basic class. But this is where it's going to become really, really important, is when we start engaging with people of a Muslim faith or of any type of Islamic background. Islam is much more willing to engage you philosophically. The reason being is because, unlike so many other faith systems that we might come into contact with, they are actually monotheistic, just like we are. If you don't know the term monotheistic, you can break that down, mono meaning one, theistic meaning of God, so one God. They believe the same thing too, but their articulation of it is much different. So sometimes this requires a philosophy, and there is good Christian philosophy out there. Philosophy is not just kind of thinking deep thoughts about being unemployed. But there is an overall philosophy that comes with Christianity. A lot of the greatest theologians in the world, their minor before they even went into the ministry was in philosophy. So they learned how to engage on a philosophical level. Muslims will do this with you if you find a one that is willing to come in faith and have a good faith conversation with you, which, unlike a lot of the other faiths that we've talked about, most Muslims will. They actually will. If you come at them with respect and not vitriol and just say, I want to talk, you will find that they are probably more willing to engage than just about any other group there is. So if we can, let's roll that video back again, and I'll start and stop it at certain points.
The Father is called Yahweh God, the Spirit is called Yahweh God, and Jesus is called Yahweh God. There's only one Yahweh. How do we figure this out? So what they do is eventually they come up with this language of being and person. Being describes what you are. Person describes who you are.
Go ahead and stop it right there. Okay, did everybody catch that? Okay, so when we talk about three beings, one person, that's what we're talking about. If we really break the language down, we're talking about being means existing in some sort of capacity, some sort of nature, but personhood is what makes you alive, right? You have personhood. And to his example, that chair has being. This pulpit has a being, right? It's being, its job is to be here. But like he says with the chair, I don't have to ask this pulpit's permission because it doesn't have personhood. So it doesn't have any type of facility to say, nope, you're not allowed to stand here behind me anymore. Go over there. Okay, so it doesn't have personhood. So being describes what you are. A person is who you are. Okay? Go ahead and start it again.
It's who you are. This chair has being. It's what philosophers call ontological status. But it doesn't have personhood. I didn't ask its permission to sit on it.
Right.
But it does exist.
Yeah.
And so being is what you are. God is Yahweh. And we see this, Jesus tells his disciples to go baptize in the name, and then he says, of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Okay, go ahead and stop it there. Okay, so that's an important point. One name, singular name, three persons. So what we're saying there is that they all possess the same being, but are three persons in one being. That's how we come up with this nature. And it's not that the early church just said, let me make something up real quick and figure this out. Going through the language of the entire text, they found that to be consistent throughout there. He's going to bring up an example here. He did say ontological nature, and if you've never heard the term ontology, it's just kind of the study of being and beginninghood, where things start, right? Not necessarily just creation by itself, but anything. Where does something start? As a Christian, I'll tell you, and I'll tell this to anybody on the street, all ontology starts with God. So if somebody asked me what the ontology of this paper is, I'd say God. Because this came from a tree that was created in an environment that was created by God. I think you can walk back the ontology of every single thing that exists to God. So what they're saying is his ontological status is eternal, forever. In a sense, almost doesn't have an ontological status because nothing had to create him. So he is the beginning of all ontology, of all beginnings, right? That's kind of that's part of the philosophical nature in which sometimes you might find yourself discussing with Islam. What he's about to bring up, though, he's about to bring up a story from Genesis 19. Who knows Sodom and Gomorrah? You guys know that story, right? Okay. A lot of people will have questions about this because there's three people there that he's talking to. Then two go into Sodom. Those two are identified as angels. But then there's one more person up on the mountain with him that isn't identified as an angel, right? This person, he keeps calling Lord. And this person seems to have an ability to change what might happen. Because he keeps asking him, what if there's 50 good men in Sodom? All right, I won't destroy it if there's 50 good men. How about 25? How about just 25? There's 25. Yeah, sure, I won't. So this person has authority. And then he's going to bring up one really key text where he says, Yahweh on earth rains down fire from Yahweh in heaven. And this is all the way back in Exodus. So that's what I mean by saying that we see this status of multiple persons in one being throughout the Bible. This is not something the early church just tried to wrangle up because of how they wrote the New Testament. We see this throughout all of redemptive history, from Old Testament through the New Testament. Go ahead and play again.
As of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So he says the singular name, but then he describes three persons. And so this is the question the early church is wrestling through. And they say, okay, Jesus is given the honors, the attributes, the names, the deeds, and the seat of God. It's an acronym, hands. The Spirit is given the honors, the attributes, the names, the deeds, and the seat of God. And the Father is given the honors, the attributes, the names, the deeds, and the seat of God. There's only one God. How do we understand this? Now, the ancient Jews actually already had a concept of this in that they weren't Unitarian fully. God can rule and reign in heaven, and yet the Ark of the Covenant could still have...
Go ahead and stop it there. He's going to say the word Unitarian quite a few times. If you don't know what that means, that just simply means monotheistic, but simply one. No three in one, one. So like when we talked about Jehovah's Witnesses last week, that would technically be a Unitarian faith. If you ever walk up to a church that says Unitarian, don't walk in. Find another church to go to. Okay? There are churches out there that'll say Unitarian church, and they may mean different things by it, but either way, don't walk into a Unitarian church. Okay? Yeah, go ahead and play again.
And yet the Ark of the Covenant could still have God's presence. before Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham is met by 3 individuals, 2 that are identified as angels and 1 that is identified as Yahweh God. The angels go off to Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham dialogues with Yahweh. Eventually, Abraham leaves, and then in chapter 19, Genesis 19, says that Yahweh on earth rains fire and brimstone from Yahweh in heaven. Now, you only have one Yahweh, so what's going on there? Well, we would say, within like a Christian framework, this is the pre-incarnate Christ.
Go ahead and stop there. That confuses people a lot too. There are a few times in the Bible, and some of them are debated among scholars, where we experience what's called a Christophany, an appearance of Christ before the New Testament, before he was Christ. There are a few other ones. Something like the burning bush would be what we call a theophany, a manifestation of God, but we see that in an inanimate object in a bush, correct? So a Christophany is sometimes considered something, a person that would be Christ before he was Christ. Jacob wrestling with God would be another example. God walking in the garden of the cool of the day in the garden would be another one. Sometimes these things are debated, whether they're Christophanies or theophanies. That's not really important. I just want to make sure people understood that term and what he was going over. Yeah, go ahead.
Framework. This is the pre-incarnate Christ. He is not enfleshed in who Jesus is, but this is the complex unity, and the Jews understand this, and even early on in rabbinical Judaism, there's also this idea of the Shevrot, which are like the presence and spirit of God all throughout the earth. So in that sense, ancient Judaism, sometimes it's called the 2 powers in heaven. I don't love that kind of articulation, but in academia, that's what it's called. That God is ruling and reigning in heaven and still has a presence on earth. Only one God, but there's something else going on there that maybe we don't fully understand, but then God lives in a set of living, loving relationships. He has existed eternally in relationship and in love. Yeah. That's what John says in 1 John. God is love. God does not need to create in order to experience anything.
Okay, go ahead and stop it there. I'll let the rest of the video play after this, but this is going to become important when it comes to Islam. We'll go over this a little bit. But the main difference, philosophically anyway, between Christianity and Islam is that to us, God is knowable, right? We can have relationship with God, and he's perfectly revealed himself in his word. In Islam, you cannot. They do not believe that who they call God is knowable. So that's what Wes is pointing out here. This is Wes Huff, if you guys ever want to look him up, one of the best young apologists out there in the world. I think he's only 30, 31, something like that. So he's kind of on the rise in Christian circles, or in theological circles anyway. So if you want to ever look up Wes Huff or Wesley Huff on YouTube, you can also look up Apologetics Canada, if you can't tell by his accent. He's Canadian. Very interesting testimony, but he's working on his doctorate right now in what we call textual criticism in ancient manuscripts. So when it comes to history and knowing and being able to break down the word into several different languages, look at the history of the languages, is one of the best you can go to. So if that's something that interests you, definitely a good guy to bring up. So that's what he's saying, is that our God, the way we view God, does not have to create, ever. Doesn't have to. He did. And Christ coming in flesh, dying as a man, was what we call, he condescended to his own creation, made himself like his own creation in order to be able to save it. Because we are not perfect, can never be morally perfect as God, but Christ is. So it would take that type of perfect sacrifice to atone for our sins. So our God actually gives us relational status and condescended to his own creation. In Islam, you can't have that. Because they have this monotheistic idea of Unitarianism, one God, to experience love, he would have to create. Because love requires, it's kind of like communication, requires a sender and a receiver. Okay? You would have to have that with love. You would have to have 2 objects, one loving the other. Even if the other didn't love back, one would have to love the other. Well, you can't have that in Islam. In Islam, he would have to create in order to do that. Our God, the way we understand the one true God, is that if he exists in Trinity, then he's had a relationship from all of eternity. So he didn't have to create, but he did. Okay? Go ahead and just let the rest of it play now.
Is love. God does not need to create in order to experience anything. Creation is an outpouring of his love. Now, this is different than, say, a Unitarian monotheistic faith like Islam. In Islam, in one sense, philosophically, God does need to create to experience love, because love requires an object and a subject. And so, in order to feel love, the Unitarian God of something like Islam needs the object in order to feel that. That's not true for Christianity. The Father has been loving the Son in the power of the Holy Spirit forever. The early Christians are wrestling through these things in order to formulate the language of this. Eventually, they come up with this idea, one being in three persons. Being describes what you are, persons describe who you are.
I like how it ends like that. Now notice, I don't know if any of you recognize the people he's talking to on there. That is a secular podcast. Wes Huff has been kind of making the circles on a lot of very popular secular podcasts. It's a blessing because you can very clearly articulate the gospel. How many of you know who Joe Rogan is? Some heads nodding. Considered, I think, the most popular podcast in the world. And Joe Rogan, a guy who's never been a Christian, as a matter of fact, kind of had quite a bit of animosity towards Christians over the years. And Wes was on that show. That's billions of people, or millions of people, listening to that podcast in which the gospel is being presented. That comes up a lot. Like, do we want to go on things like that? Do we want to do things like that? And to Wes's point, he would say, I got an opportunity to share the gospel with millions of people? Yeah. And Rogan, for as much as he's criticized Christianity over the years, is one of those guys that's always willing to have a good conversation. So it was wonderful. It's like a 2-hour program. It's a wonderful conversation. And you can definitely see all the other people that are involved in that show that are not Christians. You can see their wheels starting to spin. Like, we've never had a Christian apologist on the show. Somebody who could clearly articulate what the gospel is and what it means to offer a defense of the faith. This is the reason we teach this. Again, I'll reiterate, like I did in class 1, are all of you going to be professional apologists? No. That's a gift that is given, but it doesn't alleviate us from the responsibility of learning it and doing it to the best of our abilities, right? When we did that first class, I talked about certain fruits of the Spirit. Okay? I am not naturally a hospitality kind of guy. Not that I'm not nice or anything like that, but I had some friends at my last base who they had what they called a hospitality cupboard in their house. It was extra groceries, extra things that they put aside in case anybody came over. Like, that was something they enjoyed doing. Having people, that's a gift. That doesn't alleviate me from being hospitable. It's just not a natural gift that flows from me like it does from other people. I may have certain other gifts that you guys don't. So we all have different things that we do well. This is why we live as a family. This is why, as a church, we have a plurality of elders. So all of us experience these different gifts. But my encouragement is that all of you at least learn the basics of how to defend the faith so that you can have these conversations with people. Okay? The video I'm going to play at the end, a little bit of an emotional video for me because I just know a little bit of the background of the guy that's speaking. And I'll share a little bit more about that. But I'll just say it's an ex-Muslim who's now a Christian, and he's talking to another Muslim, one who's currently a Muslim. And I think about this guy because he's no longer with us. He died young. He died I think he was only about 40, roughly. He died of cancer. But thank God he was a Christian before he died. And I mentioned this during one of my sermons. I mentioned a quote from him. His name is Nabil Qureshi. He used to be an Islamic apologist before he was even a Christian. So he wasn't just a Muslim. He was one seeking scholarly information and wanting to do what I'm asking you guys to do with Christianity. He was doing that with Islam. And he came to this conclusion that Christians just didn't know what they were talking about, because he could never get a Christian to share their faith with him. He could never get anyone to ask, to just dialogue with him. So he was left with two conclusions. Either we don't know what we're talking about, or we don't care if he dies. That was the conclusion he came up to, until finally, one day, one person did. And that began a series of conversations that they had over time, leading to him putting Islam down and trusting in the Lord for his salvation. That's what I'm asking all of you to learn how to do, too. Some of you will struggle with it more, but in others, it'll be more natural. But we all need to do it. So because Islam does so much in the realm of philosophy, I don't have a lot for you to do on there. We do have some sheets. You got some basics of it, of the Muslim faith. There's another sheet behind it that's kind of like a sample conversation of the way, the way a conversation might go with a Muslim. So we'll just go over Islam really, really basically. First of all, historical claims versus historical reality. Islam does not present itself as a new religion. This is a common theme that we'll see, that we've already seen through some of the other faith systems that we've gone to. This just happens to be an older version of one. When we talked about Mormonism, when we talked about Jehovah's Witness, we're talking about 19th century. And that kind of took place during a time period that we call the Restoration period, where a lot of cults popped up saying they had the real faith. So Islam kind of did the same thing. However, we're talking now 7th century. So much older version. So they present themselves to be the original faith of Abraham. This is going to be key when it comes to talking to Islam. Okay. So it's a restoration of a corrupted Judaism. Somebody say corrupted Judaism and Christianity, but more going back to Abraham, he's going to say a corrupted Judaism that led to a false Christianity. So they have the real faith of what the true outpouring of Judaism should have been. That's what they're going to look at. So they would consider, the Quran, the revelation of Allah to Muhammad as being the perfect revelation. The Quran itself in Surah 3, when you hear that term Surah, it's kind of like saying chapter. So when you hear me say Surah, I'm just saying chapter of the Quran. So Surah 3 says that Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but he was Hanif, which means a Muslim. So they will try to make the claim that Abraham was actually a Muslim. Why is this historically impossible? Well, Abraham lived about 2000 BC. Muslim theology, as far as the Quran, they also have something called the 5 pillars of what it means to be a Muslim. Shahada is also referred to, did not exist until the 7th century. We find no historical evidence of anything ever taught in Islam until the 7th century. So the term Islam itself is what we would say is anachronistic when applied to Abraham. Anachronistic simply just meaning they're taking something from one time period and trying to just jam it over here to another. And it's like when Roman Catholics try to tell you that Peter was the first pope. Like, okay, so you're taking a modern term that you came up with and now you're applying it to Peter. That's kind of what Islam does with Abraham. D.A. Carson, Christian scholar. If you don't know who D.A. Carson is, I would definitely look him up if you're ever interested in Christian commentary. Good apologist himself as well. He said, you cannot retroactively impose later theological systems onto an ancient figure without itself being a rewrite of history. So you would basically have to try to rewrite history. From a physical standpoint, when we talked about different types of apologetics, if we were going to do an evidentiary look with actual physical evidences, that's what we would say to Islam. Doesn't it, you might say to a Muslim, doesn't it seem like you created something new and you're just trying to place it over here and you have no historical reason to back this up? Because they do that with a lot of things. So just a short answer to that, Islam claims that Arabs are all descended from Ishmael. Who is Ishmael? Shout it out. He was the kind of the first son of Abraham, really, wasn't he? But he was the son that Abraham had with Hagar. Instead of trusting in God, that he was going to give him a son from Sarah, which he did. But he tried to do things his own way and had a son, Ishmael. So this is how they get to Abraham. They're going to say that they are the original descendants of Ishmael. That Ishmael was the father of all Arabs. Muhammad was Arab. So we must be part of Abraham through Ishmael. Okay? So when we think of Abraham's line, Jews and Christians would take that from Isaac, because that's where it goes. That's where the covenant promise was made. They're going to say we come from Ishmael. So that's how they're going to try to direct us all back. And you might even find some Muslims who try to say, no, see, we have peace as brothers. We're all from Abraham, right? And they'll try to use that. That claim is not historically possible, as Islam presents it, because it would, one, rewrite geography. It would rewrite covenant history, and the chronological nature of it is just false. Here's the example I always use. When we look through the Old Testament, how many times do you see ites? Perizzites, Jebusites. You ever notice at a certain point in the Old Testament that just stops? Like you just don't hear those anymore? Like they're just gone. Well, the Ishmaelites, they are around, and we see them referenced throughout Genesis a few times. And we see the burial, when we talk about the burial of Ishmael, there's even a small genealogy of Ishmael. But you just stop hearing about the Ishmaelites too, along with the rest of the ites. They're just gone. My contention, I think most historical professors and other people like that would come to the same conclusion, is that once you started seeing nations being built, like Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, the Moabites, big nations that way, all those other smaller tribes just all got blended into those. They got conquered, they got taken over, lived in the same land, and just assimilated to those things. That's why you stop seeing all these really small tribal names being mentioned, and I would put the Ishmaelites right in there with that. So Muslims, as I said, do claim to be from Ishmael, and it's not a fringe thing. This is actually a core to their ideology, which is why we want to engage with it, because if you can kind of knock those blocks down, the whole building kind of falls down. It is a pillar that Islam is set up on. So as Islamic tradition will teach that, Ishmael is actually the father of all the Arabs, and then Muhammad was an Arab, so they must all be from Abraham. Muslim historian Ibn Ishaq, I think is his name. Muhammad is the descendant of Ishmael, the son of Abraham. So this is one of their own historians saying that, so it is foundational to them. But why can this not be historically possible? For other reasons. There's one problem. The covenant explicitly excludes Ishmael. The Bible does not deny Ishmael's existence. He's there, but it does deny his covenant role. This becomes important when a Muslim might tell you certain parts of the Bible that they actually agree with, because they're going to actually agree with some parts that deny that Ishmael has any covenant role altogether. Genesis 21:12 says, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." This is God saying that. So God did bless Ishmael temporarily, established a covenant, though, only through Isaac. And that continues through Jacob, then eventually called Israel. Remember, he simply just protected Ishmael. Stopped him from, starving out in the desert. And, then he eventually does kind of become the father of his own small tribe. So God did protect Ishmael, but did not establish any covenant through him. Romans 9:8, Paul confirms this. It says, "Not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of promise." And that's important because when we think of things we see in the Old Testament that are what we would say is a type or a shadow that then leads to a reality of a Messiah in the New Testament, this is simply what Ishmael represents. Our fleshly attempts. We just talked about that today in our sermon, right? A lot of times we try to make things happen when we're not trusting God. And that's exactly what Abraham and Sarah do. They're saying, wow, we're old. I don't know. Maybe God was wrong. Maybe we're supposed to do this ourselves. I know he said he would do it. So they try to figure out a way to make it happen instead of trusting that what God said would come to pass. So God, having mercy on Ishmael, protected him. Islam must also kind of, they're going to have to kind of work biblical geography to make their stuff work too. So Ishmael settles in Paran. Okay, Paran is it's just north of Mount Sinai, and it's nowhere near Mecca. It would be, about 1,000 miles away. So you're going to have to really kind of rewrite geography in order to say that Mecca would be the hub, because they will eventually try to trace back Ishmael and Abraham to both being in Mecca at some point, and that's a big stretch. Like I said, they'll try to get Abraham back there too. They have what's called the Kaaba, which is kind of their first mosque, their first temple, and they'll claim that it was built by Abraham. And we just have no historical record of that forever, and just physically that would have been pretty next to impossible. Ancient Near East scholar Kenneth Kitchen says this: "There is no evidence of Abrahamic presence in Mecca in the 2nd millennium BC. And this is not a minor detail. you're completely changing the geography of a biblical story, even though the biblical story does have actual historical evidence to back it up. The Quran does not. And as I already mentioned, the lineage gap is just completely untraceable. There's no way you can tell me that the Ishmaelites then continued on when all these other tribes have seemed to have disappeared. There's no genealogical record. The lineage doesn't appear again until about almost 2,000 years later. That's when all of a sudden Islam starts picking up theirs and tries to backtrack stuff through there, but they are unsuccessful. They never can. So their claims are merely an assertion and not backed up in any way. The reason why I can say that as Christians, we can offer evidence as if we were in a courtroom is because we have it. We can engage that way. They cannot. So when I said that Muslims are probably going to try to engage with you philosophically, that's why. Because historically, it's a mess, and they can't try to make this claim whatsoever. And then Islam, again, redefines Muslim anachronistically. Islam says Abraham was a Muslim. Obviously, we talked about the historic issues of that. Islam has a doctrine, law, worship. The Quran itself did not exist until the 7th century AD. Abraham did not pray towards Mecca, would not have known what the 5 pillars of Islam is, would not have known that Muhammad was ever going to exist, and would not confess the Shahada. When I say Shahada, that's just kind of how we have the Shema, where we say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You shall trust the Lord with all of your heart, soul, and mind." I forgot exactly what the Shahada prayer is in Islam, but it's similar to that. It's kind of like this one big profession of who God is. So calling Abraham a Muslim, again, is like I said, is like would be like calling Moses a Roman Catholic. You're taking something that didn't exist and trying to force it back in through history. So it's a retroactively imposed system. Why this matters apologetically. Islam's authority rests on these 3 stacked claims. One, that Muhammad is the heir of Abraham, and that all Arabs descend from Ishmael, so that Ishmael must be the true covenant line. So if you tear those down historically, you're going to go a long way into starting to make inroads into the mind of a Muslim as you're talking to one. What I do want to encourage you, though, is make sure that you do this. If you ever have an opportunity to do this, please do it respectfully. Because once you try to throw something out there like, "Oh, you're wrong, you made up your history, you know what you're talking about, you're a quack," you've lost them. You're done. And we do have a tendency to do that, right? As human beings, when we believe in something so deeply, we have a tendency to get offended when someone is presenting something that we would call heresy. So we always have to watch our temper. We always have to watch kind of how we do these things. So Christianity does not need to invent lineages as Islam does. It rests on public history, very obvious history, eyewitness testimony, and a crucified and risen Christ, something that they cannot say. Jesus said in John 5, "If you believed Moses, you would believe me." So on the street level, what are we looking at? Muslims claim to be the descendant of Ishmael, but God does exclude Ishmael. Ishmael lived in Paran, not Mecca. There's no historical lineage of Ishmael to Muhammad, and Islam redefines Abraham. So the conclusion to this is that Ishmael's claim is theologically retrofitting, not historical. So that might be a base level of where to start somebody with Islam. Even if a lot of us aren't comfortable with philosophy and things like that yet, so if you can at least start there, like let's just get on the ground level here and say, let's just look at history. The claims that you have made historically just don't make any sense. All right, let's talk about Allah versus the God of the Bible. So Islam teaches absolute oneness in Muslim terms, and it helps to know these Muslim terms sometimes because you won't be confused when they say it, and it also shows a little bit of respect that you at least know a little bit about them. Absolute oneness is what is called Tawhid, T-A-W-H-I-D. I can't remember if I have it on the slide or not. I don't think I do. But Islam teaches an absolute oneness. What we would say is Unitarian. They would say it's Tawhid. That is a key term to them. But at the cost of God's relational nature, which we talked about a little bit in the beginning as we were going through that video. There is nothing like unto God, is what Surah 42 says in the Quran. So nothing like him. He can be the only one that is him. But the problem is if Allah is not the Father, if he's not relational, if he's not covenantal, and if he's not incarnate, then love cannot be essential, only optional. The Bible says that God is love in 1 John, or in 1 John 4:8, excuse me. But Christian theology teaches that God did not become loving. God is eternally loving within the Trinity. So we have a God that we can say is eternally loving. They cannot. That would be part of the philosophy of it. You have a God who is rather arbitrary and can just kind of make up his own rules as they go, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. Church Father St. Augustine says, love requires both the lover and the beloved. And in God, this is eternal because of the Trinitarian nature in which we understand God. If God is just, Allah then would have no justice. It's amazing to me when we look around the world today and we see all these people that are screaming for justice, some of them defending horrific actions of Islamic people in the Middle East. And you can tell those people obviously have no idea what they're talking about. You're screaming for justice for Palestinians, but Palestinians themselves don't believe there is a such thing as justice. They can't. Not if they're honest about their Islamic faith. Because Allah does whatever he wants, however he wants, whenever he wants. So therefore, not only do they have no trust in their own salvation, they have no need for justice. Yet the people that want to defend them are out there screaming for justice. That clearly displays that you have no idea what you're talking about. I bring that up because Islam is willing to do one thing, and they do it well, that many Christians are not willing to do, and that's engage in the public square. And by public square, I mean all of it. Schools, universities, political environment, they're willing to do it all. You see a rise of Islam in America currently as we stand. A lot of people leaning that way. A lot of younger people wanting to know more about it. Why? Because they're willing to engage. They're willing to grab the young people and say, let me tell you what's going on. And we've started to lose that a little bit as Christians in America. I do see it up on the rise again, but we got to do a better job. Not all of us are meant to be in political systems. Not all of us are meant to be school teachers or things like that. But those of you who are have to be willing to engage with your faith. So in the Bible, justice is not optional. It is a part of God's very nature. God does not decide to be just. He is just. Deuteronomy 32 says, the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are just. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne, Psalm 89. He will by no means clear the guilty, Exodus 34. So the problem justice creates, if God is truly just, then sin must be punished, guilt cannot be ignored, forgiveness must be grounded, not arbitrary. This creates a dilemma. How can a just God forgive guilty sinners? Well, we know what the answer to that is. That's what Christ came to reconcile. Islam does not have this. You can talk to two different Muslims and one of them be so adherent to the 5 pillars of Islam, it seemed to have the worst life in the world. But then you can talk to another Muslim who doesn't even care what the 5 pillars of Islam are and seems to have everything. How does Islam explain that? They explain that as in, well, we don't know God. So maybe I must not be doing something right. I must only think that I'm doing things according to the 5 pillars. Maybe that guy's got it right. Because they can't know God. Everything is arbitrary. Almost starts to sound a lot like prosperity gospel after a while when you start to dig into it a little bit. Which is why I and many pastors have said there's only 2 religions in the world. There's true biblical Christianity and everything else. Because once you start to break down all these other ones, they start to look very similar. They start to look like they're coming from very similar places, which is simply the root of evil. So the gospel does solve the justice problem. Christianity does not deny justice to show mercy. It satisfies justice to show mercy. Isaiah 53, he was pierced for our transgressions. The chastisement that brought us peace was upon him. So God put Christ forward as a propitiation, as a replacement, that word means basically, to demonstrate his righteousness so he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus, Romans 3. So at the cross, justice is fully satisfied, sin is actually punished, and mercy flows without compromise. Ancient Christian theologian Anselm of Canterbury, God does not forgive by overlooking sin, but by satisfying justice. Allah has no justice, only will. In Islam, Allah is not bound by justice. Justice is whatever Allah decides at any moment. The Quran, Surah 21 says, He is not questioned about what He does. Surah 5, Allah forgives whom He wills and punishes whom He wills. Now that sounds similar to Christianity, doesn't it? Problem is throughout the Bible, we have a standard. God has given us the standard of how He does this. Not in the Quran. Because again, you have an unknowable God. Surah 16, if Allah willed, He could punish them all. All? What about the ones that are keeping to the 5 pillars of Islam? He could punish them too. So that creates the core problem. There's no moral necessity, no satisfaction of justice, no atonement, no assurance. Allah can forgive without payment, which means forgiveness is not just, it's simply arbitrary. Muslim scholar Allah Ghazali, there is no obligation upon God to reward or punish. Straight out of the horse's mouth. That means sin does not require justice. Punishment is not morally necessary, and forgiveness has no cost. Why this matters to us apologetically is that in the Bible, sin is reconciled. We're all born sinners. Not one of us escapes this world without being a sinner. But the price for that sin has already been paid. The ground is level at the foot of the cross, and all who come to it receive that mercy. It must be just a hard life for anybody in Islam that truly adheres to being Muslim. They can never know whether they're saved. Never. You would have to spend all your days working and working and working and working, thinking, am I saved? I don't know if I'm saved. I feel today like I'm saved. Now I don't. All day, every day, if you were truly adherent to Islam, you could never know really what was going to happen to you. All the martyrs that thought they were going to receive so much reward in heaven still had to think, well, I think this is going to work. I mean, Allah can take away and give as He pleases. I may not get the reward. If they were being honest with themselves, they would have to think that. A lot of them simply just have blind faith and just go, well, I'm going to do this. It seems right. Romans 6 tells us that the wages of sin is death. But the Quran would also say, in Surah 31, no soul knows what it will earn tomorrow. That's got to be weighty to them. If you're a Muslim and you don't think about that, I don't know if I'm saved. I don't ever know. Thank God we have a way to answer that. We have the reconciliation to God. So the God of the Bible forgives because justice is satisfied. Allah forgives because justice, well, it's just unnecessary, and if He decides He wants to, He can. Christianity has a cross because God is just. Islam has no cross because Allah doesn't need to define His own justice. Now, the one blessing about this, because of that, believe it or not, there are a lot of countries in this world that will be Muslim countries. But 90% of the people in that country have no idea what the Islamic faith is. I spent a whole year in Turkey. Now, have any of you guys ever heard the term nominal Christian? Ever hear anybody use that term? It's not really a real term, but people say it sometimes. Just meaning that person says he's a Christian, but he's not. Christian by name only. What we're saying is nominal. There are a lot of nominal Muslims in the world. The year that I spent in Turkey, every single Turkish civilian that worked for me hadn't been to a mosque in 20 plus years. Hadn't prayed on a rug, hadn't opened their Quran. Sound familiar? We see that a lot in Christianity in the West. So there are a lot of them like that. Those are the people, too, that I found the best conversation with, because it was almost like talking to a blank slate a little bit, because they would just call themselves Muslim because it's part of their cultural identity. I talked to a man at the shop at on base one time. I was on my way to a Bible study. I had a Bible in my hand. I stopped there to get a drink. I put the Bible down on the counter so I could grab my wallet. And he looked at it real quick, and he kind of tapped on it. And he goes, didn't speak English real well, so he was like, Word of God. And I said, yeah, that's exactly what it is. He goes, yeah. He goes, I believe in God too. He goes, I don't do this though. I don't care about all that. That's kind of the sense that I got from most of the people in Turkey. Like, they believe in God, and they're like, yeah, God help me through this. I'm having a hard time. They don't understand what the Muslim religion is, though. And you're going to find a lot of that. But the ones who do, like I said, are much more willing to engage in the public square. And I'll get a little bit cultural on you right now. We talk about generational stereotypes a lot. Like about the boomers do this, and then the Gen X's do this, and the millennials do this. And well, those stereotypes exist for a reason, because they are common. They're not facts. You can't say all boomers do this, all Gen X does this, all millennials do this. You can't say that, or else it would be a fact and not a stereotype. But we are living in a current generation right now who seems to have a desire to come back to faith. Problem is, what faith are they coming back to? Because they're going to look at the past generations and go, well, that generation was mostly Christian, and they seem to have messed everything up. So maybe I should go somewhere else. Or that generation was mostly Protestant, and I do want to be a Christian, so maybe I'll go to a Catholic church instead. And we're seeing it a lot. We're seeing a rise in Roman Catholicism, a rise in Eastern Orthodoxy, a rise in other cults like Islam, like Jehovah's Witness, like Mormons, who have a faith that somewhat looks like Christianity. And to the lay person who doesn't know any better, they might think it is. We, as Protestants with the true faith, need to do a better job at grabbing this younger generation. I'm talking about guys this age here, guys my son's age, and a little bit younger. That is a blessing, that they're seeing what's happening in the world, and they're looking at the generations before them, and they're saying, you led us here. The way some of those generations will look at the young people and go, wow, this generation's rotten. We have a tendency to do that in America, don't we? Tend to blame the current generation, like, you guys are just bad. And every generation has done that, so the generations ahead of you said the same thing. They're doing it the opposite way. They're looking back at the past generations and going, you led us here, so we're going to do something different than what you did. And we know that's not right. You can't look at a bad example and say the whole thing must be that because of one bad example. So yeah, you're going to see false churches. You're going to see bad pastors that get kicked out of churches because of nasty things. That doesn't make the whole wrong. But if we don't do a better job at communicating with that younger generation, that's all they're going to be left with. This is why guys like Charlie Kirk and other people like that were very important to this younger generation. There was somebody willing to step out and engage with them. We need to do a better job at that as well. We are seeing a rise, again, of Islam in this country, of people who were born in this country, had Christian parents, Christian uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters, but all of a sudden are wandering over into here because that's the group that's willing to talk to them. So a lot of street preachers now have taken to setting up on college campuses. Like, let me just sit here. This is where the younger people are. This is where the next generation that's going to lead us into the future is. We'll start here. And you see it there. You could put, matter of fact, this experiment's been done. You could put a Christian apologist standing on a street corner near a campus, and you could put a Muslim apologist on the other side of the campus. And there'll actually be more people gravitated towards the Christian but they'll all be there to question him, all there to try to poke holes in what they're saying, and no one's doing it to the Muslim. That's a phenomenon I think that exists in our country and some other westernized countries, because we've been the standard bearer in America for so long. They feel like if they can tear this down, then they could build everything up in their name or in their own image and what they want. So we got to come with better answers. We got to make sure we're giving them real answers. There's a couple myths that I want to go to, because there's a lot of myths about Islam. One of the reasons why some people will run to Islam because of the myths that exist. Number one, Muslims and Christians worship the same God. Islam denies God as Father, denies the Son, denies the Spirit, denies the cross. Whoever denies the Son does not have the Father. 1 John 2:23. So just because they may not always use the term Allah, sometimes they will just say God, doesn't mean we're worshiping the same person, the same God. We found this same thing when we talked about Mormons, when we talked about Jehovah's Witnesses. They're definitionally wrong on who God is, so it's a different God. Same thing here too. But you do hear this narrative a lot. I don't know how many times I've heard it on the news. They say, wow, Christians and Muslims need to come together. They are worshiping the same God. I'm like, oh, please learn what you're talking about before you say something in public like that. Myth, second one, Islam honors Jesus. Well, Islam's Jesus is not crucified, does not save, and is not Lord. So according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ has not been risen, then your faith is futile, purposeless. If Christ did not conquer death, we have no reason for faith. So Islam does not honor Jesus. It empties him of his mission. Yes, is Jesus in the Quran? Do they talk about Jesus? Has some sort of prophet or a wise teacher? Yeah, but again, they're just putting the name Jesus there. They're not talking about the actual Christ. Just because they say the name doesn't mean that they're honoring him in any way. Number three, Islam is peaceful at its core. Anyone who says that hasn't read the Quran or any of the later writings known as the Hadith. Islam explicitly teaches abrogation. What I mean by that is that, let's say there is something peaceful in the Quran. If a later prophet says that no longer applies, then it no longer applies. That's what we call abrogation. It just means continuing revelation, and it can change. We have this argument sometimes with Pentecostals who believe that there's still current prophecy. They're like, yeah, but do you ever notice that all the continuing prophecy that you guys have actually contradicts what the Bible's already said? So the Word of God was right then, but it's not now? Well, how am I to trust any of that? Something I would have to ask a Muslim as well, too. If you're allowed to just change some stuff along, and there have been, not only is there already warlike motifs in the Quran, but later writings have gotten even more warlike. So you can say at its core, it's peaceful because there are some peaceful things in it, but they've continued to add onto it, and really a lot of the things that have been added have been definitely murderous things. Muslim scholar Ibn Kathir, the verse of the sword abrogated every treaty of peace. So if there's a verse in the Quran about killing, about the sword, then it doesn't matter about any of the peaceful things that happened before that. It's now the sword. And that's one of their own scholars admitting it right there. So peace is temporary, but dominance is final. That's why you see so many refugees from Islamic countries coming here wanting to take part in our system, wanting to now build whole cities, if you paid attention to what's going on in Texas. Cities that will only be for them. They have the audacity to do it. They have the audacity in their faith to do it. And again, we've already beat this one up pretty good. Muslims are Abraham's covenant descendants. I think we've already covered that enough. Kenneth Kitchen again, there is no evidence of Abrahamic activity in Mecca in the 2nd century. The note sheets you have here are just some basics. and some verses to look up. The second sheet you have is a kind of an example conversation. Starts like this. And again, this is not a script. You're not always going to be able to make it go this way. I'm just giving this as an example. It says, the Muslim says, we believe Abraham was Muslim. And the Christian says, did Abraham follow the 5 pillars of Islam? Muslim says, no, but he did submit to God. The Christian then says, then submission alone defines Islam. All you have to do is simply submit. Muslim says, yes. Okay, then the Christian says, then every prophet is Muslim, even those who denied Muhammad. I would have to cause them to pause. Christian, did Abraham go to Mecca? Muslim says yes. Christian says, where's the evidence outside the Quran? And Christian says, if the Quran contradicts the Bible historically and contradicts history externally, how do we know Muhammad was correct about anything? One thing I do want you guys to stay away from is ad hominem attacks. Ad hominem attacks are basically akin to name calling. There's a lot of Christians out there to be like, well, Muhammad was an illiterate, poor dirt farmer. For one, you're not going to make headway with anybody saying that, and two, it's not true. We do have historical evidence to show that Muhammad was actually, maybe he was illiterate, but a lot of people were illiterate back then. He did try to seek answers from Jews, and he did try to seek answers from Christians, and he didn't like anything he was hearing. He also grew up in what I would say is a hotbed of Gnosticism. We've talked about the Gnostics before, special knowledge, they had the real truth, sounds similar to today. I'm glad the world's changed so much. But there were so many different Gnostics as well, too, especially around in that area where he grew up. And I can say this about almost all ancient Near Eastern religions that popped up. Islam, Buddhists, Hindus, Baha'i, which is also a very highly growing faith. If you've never heard Baha'i yet, they all sound the same. They're all kind of doing the same thing. And you can easily see how if you took the parts maybe you did like of Judaism and the parts you did like of Christianity and the parts you liked of all the different Gnostic religions around and jam them together, you could come up with Islam pretty easily. And you could come up with Buddhism pretty easily. You could come up with Hinduism very easily. You could come up with the Sikh faith very easily. Sikhs and Baha'i are very close to Islam. Baha'i would just call itself basically an extension of Islam. They would honor Christ as prophet, like they would with Abraham and Moses, and then Jesus, and then they would honor Muhammad too, but then they have a couple other prophets that come along after that. Baha'i being the last one. But all those religions in the ancient Near East all have this similarity to them. They're just a continuation of other things. We're going to roll this last video. We'll end on this. Pretty good timing. Again, this is an example of probably how you're going to have to engage a Muslim. Try to ignore the historical facts that they just get wrong. And they're going to have to try to go this. Again, this is Nabil Qureshi. He's with the Lord now. But he's doing a question and answer session in which some people are just asking him questions as a Christian apologist. And a Muslim man steps up to ask him some questions about pretty much why he's a Muslim and wondering why Nabil's not a Muslim anymore. Go ahead and roll it.
Assalamu alaikum. Salam.
So being a Muslim, as you can already mentioned, my main problem is with the Christian doctrine of Godhood of Jesus. Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of questions that are related. First of all, I find this concept logically fallacious. Like there are many aspects to its logical fallacy, as in maybe one of them could be that how can God be finite and then infinite at the same time? Like this is like it's like saying that there could exist a square circle. It's a logical fallacy, right? So when we say that Jesus was God or Son of God, we are actually saying that God existed in finitude during the life of Jesus, and he also is infinite at the same time. This is logically fallacious. Now, because you are you're coming from a historical standpoint.
Did you want me to respond to that, or are you heading
It's a
something
relate,
else?
like the same question continuing. So because you're coming at it from a historical standpoint, another thing that adds, like the historical evidence that adds, that supports this argument, is that the concept of Trinity, the word Trinity itself, it doesn't appear as a theological term till near the end of the 2nd century after Jesus. So it was first used as trias by Theophilus, the bishop of Antioch, in AD 180. So we can, adding up to that, when you refer to Mark chapter 14, verse 62, which is what you say is the proof that Jesus claimed to be God, are you really applying the same criteria of objectivity that you were applying previously to the Quran when interpreting this as meaning that Jesus is claiming himself to be God? Because if you look at it completely objectively, looking at the entire text, there is nothing in the entire text that's saying that Jesus claimed to be God. And in fact, the verse that you yourself quote is actually saying Son of Man. So, I mean,
These are great questions. Don't go anywhere. What's your name?
Munzir.
Munzir, where are you from?
I'm from Pakistan.
Pakistan. बहुत खुशी हुई आपसे मिलके. I had the exact same questions when I was when I practiced Islam. What I want to point out is that first and foremost, what we have to see is what Jesus claimed for himself. Now, the secondary stuff that follows, the theological unfolding or unpacking of what he said, we can spend years and years debating what it means. But what did he say about himself? That's the first thing we want to look at. So, again, that's a historical perspective. Theologians argue all day long, back and forth, back and forth. You know, theologians argue all the time, and I just sit back and watch and smile because you can't really prove it one way or another. But when it comes to historical events, we can show with relative degrees of certainty, if the evidence is good, if the records are good, what the most likely conclusion is. So first, and let me give you an answer before, if you feel like interjecting, we can talk afterwards. First, I want to point out you are absolutely right. The term Trinity is not used till the end of the 2nd century. What is the doctrine of God called in the Quran? In Islam, what is the doctrine of God called?
Tawheed.
Tawheed. Is that in the Quran?
No,
the word Tawheed.
The word Tawheed is a derived word from Ahad.
Alhamdulillah.
Yes.
Good. So you understand, the word Tawheed is not itself in the Quran. In the same way, the word Trinity is not itself in the Bible. This doesn't pose a problem. The Shahada is not found in the Quran. You have the components of the Shahada in the Quran, but you do not, you do not have La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah in that way found in the Quran. The components are found in the Quran. With the Trinity, the components are found in the Bible. So,
the word Tawheed does appear in the Hadith.
Oh, that's great, but it's not in the Quran.
Narrations of the Prophet.
And the Hadith is much later. So we're looking at you asked for the Bible, and we have within the early canonical tradition, people calling God a Trinity in the early canonical tradition. In fact, much closer to Jesus' time than the Hadith were to Muhammad's time. So whichever way you stack it, when you're consistent, you end up with a stronger case for the Trinity, for Jesus' deity. Now I want to continue on to your next part of your question, which is Jesus finite or infinite? The argument is that Jesus is, actually I'm going to pose it in a slightly different way. Can Allah come onto this world if He wants? Can He be in this world if He wants?
I wouldn't think so.
You wouldn't think so. So Allah's omnipotence is limited. He can't come onto this world.
It's like basically Allah Ta'ala cannot do logically fallacious thing. Like He cannot create a square circle, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's something logically fallacious.
But how do we know that's what this is?
That Allah
but how do we know that's what this is? Because, for example, in Surah Al-Imran, when Allah is talking to Moses, it says in Surah Al-Imran, I think it's Surah Al-Imran, it might be Surah 18, but double check, that Allah, as He spoke to Moses, Allah was in the bush. Allah was in the bush. So if you want to say that meant something else, well, you're going to have to argue with the Quran on that one. It seems to be pretty clear that Allah can emanate His voice from a physical place. He can be in a physical place in a sense. In the same way, I don't believe that God coming to this earth limits His omnipotence. It's not a limitation of His omnipotence. Jesus has taken on flesh. God the Father is still everywhere. God, Jesus, the Son, is here on this earth. It's a limitation in that sense, but it's not a limitation of His nature. He is both the divine and human nature. That's the argument. Now, I want to talk about briefly, and then we're going to have to go to the next question, but let's talk afterwards for sure. You asked about the Son of Man. You said he's not calling himself the Son of God, he's calling himself the Son of Man. I'm emphasizing to you, my friend, when this hit me, again, while I was practicing Islam, when this hit me, it hit me like a bolt of lightning. The claim Son of God, according to Jews at that time, was not anything divine. Adam was called the Son of God. Solomon was called the Son of God. In the Psalms it says, you are gods. It's not a divine claim to call someone a son of God. But when someone refers to that Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, who's going to receive glory, authority, and sovereign power, and people of every nation and language are going to worship him with the worship due only to God, that Son of Man is more than just a human. He is divine. He's going to be worshipped by all people of all time. So when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, it's not the Son of God title. And lots of Christians get this wrong, so I'm not pointing the finger at you. Lots of Christians say, oh, Son of Man means he's human, and Son of God means he's God. No, it's the other way around. In the Jewish context, Son of God was a normal human title. Son of Man, from Daniel 7, that was something divine. Go back and read Daniel chapter 7. See that this man is worshipped by all people from all eternity. This man, or one who looks like a human anyway, is worshipped by all people alongside of God the Father. That's the one Jesus is claiming to be. Definitely understand that point that I'm trying to make. And so when you see that Jesus' claim is found there in Mark 14:62, it's found in all the Gospels, and every time Jesus uses the term Son of Man, he's alluding to that. You cannot extract that from the Gospels. So please put Mark 14:62 next to Daniel chapter 7 and see what Jesus is claiming for himself. And we'll talk afterwards for the rest. Lord bless you, my friend.